Foreword. I'm writing this foreword after I've completed receiving the teachings of Jesus. During my communion with the Father, I have asked him if there is any need for any introduction, foreword, before reading the teachings presented by Jesus. The Father has requested that I would write the foreword explaining as to how I started communing with him, how I started receiving his teachings, how the presentation of the teachings of Jesus was progressing, so that people would understand, at least to some measure, how these things are possible. And I have also been asked to divide all the teachings into the chapters, and as well as to give them the titles. I have done all that with a big love and devotion. Since the Father has been teaching me all the time that I would look upon everything as a system, all the parts of which are directly or indirectly interconnected, I must give you some broader context so that you would conceive that the association with the Father and with Jesus has not been my personal whim or a sudden fancy. There was a long leading and preparation from within, imperceptible even to me, and very often difficult and painful to me. When 13 years ago I was given the Rancher book in English, I had no idea that it would change all my life, would lead me to a direct communion with the Father, with Jesus, of whom I have learned so much from this book, like from nowhere else. Here I want to insert a short note. When I wrote it was 13 years ago, I received the teachings of Jesus as back as 2006 in my native language, Lithuanian. After a while, I decided to translate this message, just a book, into English. It took me some time to do the job. Today, it is 2024, so that's already a long portion, a long span of time that has passed since the moment I received these teachings of Jesus and translated them into English. However, the Father has been changing my life already since my very birth. Now I will mention just some of the episodes. Since my very childhood, all the time I had been planning to become a military officer. While I got enrolled in the Vilnius University in the capital of Lithuania to study the English language and literature. Meanwhile, at high school, in the penultimate grade, my marks in English in the term would still balance at the brink of satisfactory and unsatisfactory. My command of other subjects was good, while as to the English language, I was simply neglecting it and calling it as the language of birds, because I understood nothing during the classes in English. However, during the final high school summer vacation, absolutely unexpectedly to me, I began to study English just by myself. And I studied it every day according to a program presented to me by the unknown and invisible to me forces. I neither saw nor felt these forces, while the system of learning I applied every day I consider to be designed by me. It is only now that I realize that I had no idea as to how I had to study the English language that I disliked so much. Even today, this method is not being applied by any schools and universities. Just envision me being merely a 17-year-old lad to whom English is the most disliked subject, taking up this very subject during the summer school vacation without any reason, and just by himself at that. And the system was so wonderful that after the 3 months of my daily work, I did outmatch all the top students of my grade. My teacher in English and the classmates could not believe it, but I had no intention of topping anyone in the subject. That was just my daily routine for the 3 months without any clear goal. I had no definite conscious motivation for this study. However, I got surprised by the fact that I enrolled in the university to study English rather than a military academy, as I had planned before. Therefore, in the course of the first 2 years at the university, during the classes, my mind would wander. What I am doing here, why I am not at a military academy, what I am seeking by such a choice. All those who graduate from the university English department become teachers. And not only could I not imagine myself as a teacher, but I did not even allow my mind to entertain this idea at all. That was the profession I would not have agreed to choose for any money. During the second year of my studies at the university, for the first time in Lithuania, there was formed a special study group of translators that I was enrolled into without any request on my part, without having been asked whether or not I desired to study in this group. Its curriculum included additional subjects to the ordinary ones studied by the students of English. These were the theory of translation, the history of translation, the practice of translation, the grammar and syntax of the Lithuanian language, the stylistics of the Lithuanian language, and the text editing. We also had to accumulate our practical skills not only during our practice term as high school teachers, but also in a publishing house as editors. Therefore, the study curriculum of this group was much more intensive than that of the other part of the department. And in general, the curriculum of the foreign language department was very hard, for nobody could learn a foreign language for you if you did not study it yourself. Some 5 months prior to my graduation from the university, I was suggested by one teacher that I would apply for a vacancy in the Lithuanian National Television and Radio Company, where he had a part-time job. He was a radio presenter in English at the Department of Radio Programs to overseas listeners that was reporting in 3 languages, Lithuanian, Polish, and English. This radio service was meant for the Lithuanian immigrants, since around 1 million Lithuanians lived overseas out of the total population of 3.5 million. He informed me that there was a vacancy in English section. Thus, several months before the end of my studies, I started to work in the National Television and Radio Company. Unfortunately, at least I thought at that time, not in the English, but for the unknown reason to me, in the Lithuanian section. I was making programs on economy and youth life, since I was also well versed in these fields. But that is a different story. And very soon my mind was again raising these very similar questions to the ones of my first 2 years at the university. What have I studied English for to be working as a journalist in the Lithuanian rather than English section. Even though there was a vacancy there, I was not transferred to the English section during the whole year. Therefore, during all this year, I was really intensively pondering over this issue as to how I might be transferred to the section and why they were not doing it, and only giving me vague explanations and inventing ever new excuses. That was my training for my future encounter after nearly 2 decades with the Urantia book and for its translation into Lithuanian. This way, the Father helped me improve and brush up my skills in Lithuanian, including its style. And once I mastered it to a professional level, he allowed me to submerge into a practical application of English. Eventually, I was transferred to the English section. When I was given a copy of the Urantia book in English, I had no idea of either the book itself or how it appeared on the planet altogether. It was simply brought to me and handed in a cardboard box. It looked enormous. A book of 2,097 pages, plus 60 pages of the table of contents, and of a big size. While reading it, I was receiving the answers to the questions I had previously raised, which had not been convincingly and reasonably answered by anyone, either by priests, philosophers, theologians, books, or by my own speculations. Having read the Urantia book, I felt within me that it was necessary to broadcast this book to people simply on the streets, in big and small cities, villages, and farmsteads. It has such power that it is beyond understanding how a book can have such as that. It is only thanks to it that I began to realize ever more what God the Father is, who Jesus is, what the divine universe is, and how it operates. I began delivering lectures in the House of Teachers in the capital city of Vilnius every Friday. I was preparing for my classes very hard every day. Actually, I have been doing it up to date because the Urantia group still has weekly classes on Fridays since February of 1994. Here I should make a break and insert a note. Several years ago, I moved to another city, so I do not live in Vilnius anymore, and I do not have any classes of the Urantia book group in Vilnius, in the House of Teachers. It is during these classes, actually, while getting ready for them, by translating a small portion of each week's reading, that I have taken up the translating of the Urantia book from English into Lithuanian. However, I did not realize for a long time that I had already started the translation process. I simply was targeting weekly sessions with the Urantia group, and for that, I needed 12 pages of the original text to be translated for reading during a 2-hour class without making any breaks. I had no idea at all of translating such a huge book and of such a difficult text. Moreover, I was certain that this book was actually beyond translation into any language, the only book on the planet, because its information was so profound and presented in such in-depth and huge layers that are so subtly interwoven into one united system. and today I can firmly state it is really impossible to translate it properly without the Father's assistance. However, after some 2 years of this work, an idea struck my mind that it would be wonderful to have this book in Lithuanian as well. How many more people could read it? But even then, I would drive away this type of an idea that it would be possible to translate the whole book. And it was only when I had already accumulated over 1,000 pages of the translated text in handwriting while preparing for the Urantia group classes that I began to feel a tremendous resolution within me, as if someone had waked this resolution up from the sleep to translate all the text of the book. And by this time, I had already gained self-confidence as to how to deal with the sophisticated and very unusual text. And once I made a decision to translate the Urantia book and get it published in Lithuanian, I began to feel as if some invisible force started leading me from within so strongly and assisting me in formulating those long sentences, as if prompting me that I must correct something on some definite page of the translated text, even several hundred pages back. And it seemed to me that this invisible power is very close and dear to me, and it has a desire to help me. And that made me smile, as well as it caused my curiosity whether it was really so, the way I was feeling. And then I would go back to the text, looking for mistakes on the pages pointed out, and I would really find them. At home, just before falling asleep, I started contemplating, praying in my own words. I was very careful while choosing the words merely not to pledge too much to God. I was abiding by the principle, if a word was used in my prayer, I also became responsible to follow that word in my life. If I prayed for a bigger understanding of God, it meant that I had to seek a bigger understanding of God. If I prayed for a bigger mercy, I myself had to be more merciful. If I agreed with the will of God, it meant I had to acknowledge it without any excuse for having the situation in my favor. Therefore, my prayer might have been called as my haggling with the Father, while searching for such words that could be acceptable to Him, and at the same time would not obligate me and would not restrain the then freedom of mine. However, the words of my prayer were changing. They became ever deeper, and I started experiencing a sense of peace. Once, while translating the Urantia book in a small dark room, when only a desk lamp was lighting up the book, I suddenly experienced a tremendous blast within me. I was exclusively overflooded with warmth and a love surge. I desired to thrust myself out onto the street and cry out to all, "My dears, I have discovered Him, and I do desire to share Him with you, whether you are healthy or ill, even with the catching diseases, whether you are rich or poor. I do desire to explain to all about Him." I discovered that all my fear had evaporated. I simply noticed I had no sense of fear anymore. It was replaced by the fullness of the feeling of love. That was my birth of spirit that Jesus had spoken about. The flesh of man is the same, but absolutely different is his character. The feeling of love for all, without any preference for those who are of my own kin or who are not, has all the time been growing and strengthening since that moment. All have become of my own kin. It was then that I realized, or rather began to feel, that I became free. Free from fear, free from anger, free from irritation, free from jealousy, free from the desire to dominate others. And the negative qualities have been replaced by a wonderful sense of love, by an enormous mercy, by a desire to serve all without seeking any reward for it. It was only then that I realized why Jesus was called the Deliverer. When I started my regular classes in the second largest city of Lithuania, Kaunas, in addition to those in Vilnius, capital of Lithuania, I began to experience in the course of the class that somebody was helping me fluently form up my thoughts, convey them, and even with a certain modulation of the volume of my voice. My preparation for the class would always include my prayer in the car on the way to Kaunas. That was about 65 miles. And my petition to the Father, to Jesus, that I would be assisted to express the ideas they wanted me to. I would simply pray that the Father speak through my lips. And he spoke so marvelously that even during the very class, at some moments, I would also feel as if listening from without to what he was saying. At that time, I did not share this experience with my brethren, so they did not know anything about my own personal experiences during these very classes. And on the way back home in my prayer, I would always express my thanks for this wonderful leading and experiences during the class. It has lasted for several years, and this long-term experience has enabled me to know for certain that the Father does really operate through a human being. He is speaking through a man so that another man would be able to hear him. This man cannot yet hear the voice of the Father on his own. When I set up the temple of God the Father and His Son Jesus, and started leading the service every Saturday, then I began to feel how the prayer was pouring out of the very depth of my soul rather than from my human mind. When during the first prayer service in a small park, a wonderful odor was emitted, then I sensed, rather than realized, that we were given this physical sign to the end that the Father allowed us to feel with our sense organs that He could provide us a message of His presence among us. But He was giving us such a message that would provide us bliss, that would not frighten us. On the contrary, that would give us that sort of peace that we cannot feel in our ordinary state. Then I recalled the episode of several years past, when, while flying from Paris to Vilnius from an international conference of the translators of the Audiobook, I was shown in the air the sign of the three concentric circles, the symbol of the Paradise Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit, being used in our local universe. Therefore, I was not surprised by the pleasant scent poured out upon us in the park during our prayer service. However, when this odor caught up with me while I was riding a bike out of the city, then I also began to feel warmth within me and a surge of love. And again, I recalled the same experience I had both while flying from Paris and when my birth of the Spirit had taken place. And after bicycling, Having returned home, I sensed the very same scent in the bathroom. It was so strong that I started sniffing a lump of soap, whether or not it was from the soap. The scent of the soap seemed to be very crude. Meanwhile, in the kitchen I smelled already a different scent, even more pleasant. And in the room there was still the third type of odor, outmatching the previous two. I had no doubts about the spiritual origin of these three different sorts of fragrance. I had the incense I enjoyed very much, and the odor poured out in the room. I had the incense I enjoyed very much, and to my understanding of a very refined taste. Yet as I compared it with the odor poured out in the room, the incense was far from matching that unearthly subtle fragrance. It is beyond description. It was so subtle, soft, and refreshing. That was a reward to me for establishing the temple of God the Father and His Son Jesus, and the service of the worship of the Father of Spirit. After some time I started applying a stillness practice, when after my personal worship of the Father, I would sit in silence for a while, just awaiting to hear what the Father was telling me, as I'd made an attempt doing it several years earlier. I had failed to hear him, therefore I gave up the stillness practice, for I was even thinking it might be not exactly real, or my level was not yet up to hearing the Father's teachings, being passed personal to me as well as to any other human. Yet the leading from within was such that maybe some 2 years later, I again returned to this practice, and this time I did hear the Father. I was overwhelmed with joy that he was receiving his teachings, and that I can talk with him whenever my soul desires this communion and opens up for this association. That was such a tremendous encouragement to me while walking on the spiritual path, and that I had not experienced anything of the kind before, even though I had many different spiritual experiences on that path, even appearances to my eyes. Therefore, I started ever more urging all my brethren to seek a personal relationship with the Father, with Jesus, so that they could also feel these priceless to the growth of one's soul direct teachings that were being adapted to each of us individually, according to that person's ability to understand and receive them. As I began to keep this sort of the relationship with the Father every day, my communion with Him was deepening and strengthening. He often is telling me, "You must trust me more. The more you commune with me, the bigger is your trust in me, as well as your self-confidence. The more sophisticated teachings of mine you are capable of receiving. This association is necessary to everybody, yet not everybody is ready for it. Therefore you must also urge others to look within and discover me within themselves and establish this bilateral communion." When my communion with the Father had become an indivisible part of my life, it was only then that I did realize how Jesus had managed to talk with the Father. And it was then that the Father urged me, in addition to my communion with Him, to associate with Jesus as well. Thus I started short sessions of my association with Jesus, even though my soul was leaning to the Father. However, gradually, while associating with Jesus, I developed a bigger desire for this communion with Him too. Some 5 months ago, I was emailed by my brother in spirit some spiritual teachings of Jesus. They were named Letters of Jesus. They had been revealed in English. Once I read them, I had a strong desire to translate them into Lithuanian. They were so profound in assisting man in taking a deeper look upon reality and upon Jesus, as well as upon the meaning of one's own life. They have been revealed through a woman in Africa. I was pondering for several days whether or not to take up translating the letters of Jesus into Lithuanian so that other people in Lithuania might get acquainted with them. Our people do need such teachings of Jesus. However, eventually I made up my mind to take counsel with the Father on this issue. The Father backed up my idea and suggested that I would talk this matter over with Jesus directly. The way you both shall agree upon, shall it be. However, prior to the addressing Jesus, my mind was pierced with the thought that instead of asking Jesus for the license on translating his letter into Lithuanian, I would rather ask him for being given similar teachings in Lithuanian, so that it would be the original teaching meant for our people rather than the translation of his letters. Once I established communion with Jesus and told him that I had an intention of asking him for this permission of his for translating his letters revealed by him in English, and right before establishing that association with him, the thought had cut through my mind that perhaps he could also dictate me the original teaching that would be more fitting to our people, so that they would know it was not a translation but his original teaching. Jesus supported this idea and suggested our daily association at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was an early time for me. Usually I would go to bed past midnight and would wake up at about 7:30. Earlier, the Father had recommended me, even several times, to change my daily routine, to get up at least at 6 o'clock in the morning. However, I could follow this daily routine just for several days, since having gone to bed late, I had much trouble at getting up at 6. And still having gotten up at this early hour, I was feeling sleepy during the day, so that I had to take a nap. However, the desire to receive the teachings from Jesus generated a great impulse to transform my routine. I did accept the time proposed by him. On the eve of our first mutual cooperation session, I was feeling a much stronger anxiety than during the several other days prior to it. Whether or not I shall manage to get up in time, whether I shall have enough of sleep to receive his teachings at such an early hour, what sort of teachings they shall be, whether I shall manage to receive them, and many other questions were circling in my mind. From time to time, the teachings being given to me by the Father, I took down both in English and Lithuanian. The English texts I mailed to my brethren in the United States onto a conference list, while the translated texts into Lithuanian I put on our website, urantia.lt. Spelling should be like this: Urantija, Urantia, the name of our planet, as registered by Divine Archives. If the teachings of the Father I was receiving in Lithuanian, then I would translate them into English, and vice versa. In a word, I had some experience in receiving the teachings of the Father in both languages and taking them down while receiving them. That was also a long, progressive step of my growth from hearing the Father for the first time to being able to take his teachings down on paper. However, now Jesus shall be giving me his detailed teachings that I have no idea as to what way they shall be developing and when they might be completed, maybe making even a separate book. Therefore, they most likely shall be consistent and extensive, and of the sort I have never received before. Thus, it had to be a new experience to me as well. However, I was certain that everything was possible with the Father. Therefore, I began to worship the Father and pray for all even more intensively. And I was petitioning for myself a bigger devotion to the Father and a deeper wisdom from Him. Every morning, even before 6, I would begin with my worship of the Father and a petition prayer for all, and for my complete devotion to the Father's will and the reception of the teachings of Jesus. I would feel a little quiver within, as if somebody would connect me to a different frequency of vibrations, where my own thoughts just a moment ago, as if sinking down to the bottom of my own mind, and I would be filled up with completely different thoughts from Jesus. I merely needed to register them, typing them on computer, the way I had been doing while taking down the teachings of the Father. This type of association with Jesus lasted for 2 months. When it was completed, I began to correct my typing mistakes. However, I did not correct either grammar mistakes or style, apart from very few instances with incorrect cases of nouns. Therefore, you must not be strict in judging a rather difficult style, for I had no right to make it easier. The sort of the text I have received from Jesus, this very text I am presenting to you. The teaching is by Jesus. Its receiving and its transcript are mine. Its study and application are yours. I express my deepest gratitude to the Father for leading me to the idea of translating this revelation from Lithuanian into English, and for his hand of help through Martin Greenhut and William Hayes, both of the United States of America, for their exclusively wise editing of the translation, so that the style of Jesus Christ in the Lithuanian revelation is preserved in English. My sincere gratitude is also meant for Arnoldas Paleckis for the book and cover design. Peace be upon you, with brotherly love, Algimantas.